I never believed in fate until I found my husband's diary hidden inside our bathroom medicine cabinet. What I discovered inside those pages led me to follow him to therapy sessions. I never knew he was attending. But it was what I overheard when the therapist said my name that changed everything I thought I knew about our marriage. The medicine cabinet door had been sticking for weeks, one of those minor household annoyances that you promise yourself you'll fix eventually, but never quite get around to addressing. Tuesday morning, rushing to grab my birth control pills before work, I gave it an extra firm pull. The door swung open with such unexpected force that everything inside came tumbling out onto the marble countertop. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Prescription bottles scattered, my face cream rolled toward the sink, and something heavy thudded against the floor. I knelt down to retrieve what had fallen, expecting to find another bottle of vitamins, or maybe the bottle of aspirin that had been precariously balanced on the top shelf. Instead, my fingers closed around a small leather-bound book, roughly the size of my palm, with a cover so worn the original color was impossible to determine. The leather felt soft and supple, as if it had been handled countless times, and when I turned it over, I saw Daniel's initials embossed in faded gold lettering on the front cover. My heart did this strange little skip that I couldn't quite explain. In 15 years of marriage, I had never seen this book before. Daniel wasn't the type of man who kept diaries or journals. He was practical, methodical, the kind of person who made lists on his phone and kept important documents in clearly labeled file folders. The idea of him writing in a leather journal seemed as unlikely as finding him taking up watercolor painting or learning to tango. I sat back on my heels, the book heavy in my hands, and tried to remember the last time I had thoroughly cleaned out this medicine cabinet. Probably 6 months ago, maybe longer. How long had this been hidden here, tucked behind the bottles and tubes we used every day, invisible in plain sight? The placement seemed deliberate, not like something that had been carelessly shoved into an available space, but like something that had been carefully concealed. The rational part of my mind, the part that had learned to respect boundaries and privacy over 15 years of marriage, told me to put the book back where I found it. Daniel obviously hadn't intended for me to find it, and whatever was inside was his business, not mine. We had always been good about giving each other space, trusting each other's need for privacy. I had my own small secrets. After all, the romance novels I read on my lunch breaks that I never mentioned because they seemed silly, the way I sometimes called my sister to complain about things Daniel did that weren't really worth discussing with him directly. But there was something about the weight of the book in my hands, the way the leather felt warm against my palms, that made me hesitate. I found myself studying Daniel's initials, tracing the faded gold letters with my fingertip. When had he gotten this? Where had it come from? And more unsettling, why had he felt the need to hide it from me? Our bathroom was small, barely large enough for 2 people to get ready simultaneously, and suddenly it felt claustrophobic. I could hear Daniel moving around in our bedroom, the familiar sounds of him getting dressed for work, the soft thump of his feet hitting the floor as he got out of bed, the whisper of hangers sliding across the closet rod, the gentle thud of dresser drawers opening and closing. In about 10 minutes, he would appear in the bathroom doorway, hair still damp from his shower, asking if I had seen his favorite tie, or reminding me about dinner plans we had made for the weekend. The normalcy of these sounds, the predictable rhythm of our morning routine, somehow made the presence of this hidden book feel even more surreal. This was our life, orderly, comfortable, transparent. We were the couple our friends envied, the ones who never seemed to fight, who finished each other's sentences, and shared inside jokes that made us laugh even after all these years. The idea that Daniel might be keeping secrets, writing thoughts he didn't want to share with me, felt like finding a crack in what I had always believed was a solid foundation. I stood up, the book still clutched in my hands, and caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. My face looked pale, uncertain, and I realized I was holding my breath. This was ridiculous. I was 38 years old, a successful marketing director, a woman who made important decisions every day without second-guessing herself. I was standing in my own bathroom, in my own house, holding something that belonged to my husband, and acting like I had stumbled upon some dangerous secret. But what if I had? The thought appeared unbidden, and once it was there, I couldn't shake it. What if this innocent-looking journal contained something that would change everything? What if Daniel had been struggling with something he felt he couldn't share with me? What if there were problems in our marriage that I had been too comfortable, too complacent, to notice? I thought about our relationship over the past few months, searching for signs I might have missed. Had Daniel seemed distant lately? Had there been moments when he seemed lost in thought, unreachable in a way that hadn't been there before? Now that I was actively looking for them, small things began to surface in my memory. The way he had started taking his phone with him everywhere, even to the bathroom, the fact that he had begun working late more often, coming home with stories about projects and deadlines that seemed somehow vague when I asked for details. The subscription to a gym that had appeared on our credit card statement 3 months ago, even though Daniel had never expressed any interest in working out. None of these things had seemed significant at the time. Daniel's job as a software consultant had always involved irregular hours, and it wasn't unusual for him to have busy periods followed by slower weeks. The gym membership had made me happy. Actually, I had been gently encouraging him to find some form of exercise for years, worrying about his sedentary lifestyle, and the way he had started developing the soft middle-age spread that seemed to appear overnight on men in their 40s. When he had mentioned joining a gym, I had been supportive, even excited, imagining the two of us working out together, maybe taking couples yoga classes, or going for evening walks around our neighborhood. But now, with this mysterious journal in my hands, these innocent explanations felt naive. What if the gym membership wasn't about fitness at all? What if the late nights at work were something else entirely? What if the phone that had become permanently attached to his hand was receiving messages from someone I didn't know about? The jealousy that surfaced surprised me with its intensity. I had never been a jealous person, had never felt the need to check Daniel's email or question his whereabouts. Our marriage had been built on trust, on the comfortable assumption that we were both exactly who we appeared to be. The possibility that this assumption might be wrong felt like the ground shifting beneath my feet. I flipped the journal over in my hands, examining it from every angle, as if its physical appearance might reveal its secrets. The leather was genuine, expensive looking, not the kind of thing you would pick up impulsively at a drugstore. Someone had chosen this carefully, had selected it as something worth investing in. The pages looked thick and creamy, the kind that would feel substantial under a pen, and when I held the book up to the light, I could see that many of the pages had been written on. The temptation to open it was overwhelming, like an itch I couldn't quite reach. Just a quick look, I told myself, just enough to satisfy my curiosity and put my mind at ease. Surely there was an innocent explanation for all of this. Maybe Daniel had started keeping a journal on the advice of his doctor, a way to manage stress or process work-related problems. Maybe it was a gift from someone, his sister perhaps, who was always giving thoughtful but slightly impractical presents. Maybe he had been planning to tell me about it, but hadn't found the right moment. Even as I constructed these reasonable explanations, I knew I was going to open the journal. The need to know had become stronger than my respect for Daniel's privacy, stronger than my fear of what I might find. I told myself that if I discovered something innocent, I would simply put the book back and never mention finding it. No harm done, curiosity satisfied, marriage intact. But if I found something else, something that confirmed the growing unease in the pit of my stomach, then I would deal with that when it happened. My hands were trembling slightly as I opened the cover. The first page was blank, except for Daniel's name written in his careful, precise handwriting in the upper right corner. The second page contained a date from 3 months ago, and below it, several paragraphs of text that made my heart start beating faster as I read the first few lines. Sarah doesn't know I'm writing this, and I'm not sure she ever will. There are things happening in my life right now that I can't talk to her about, things I'm not sure she would understand. The marriage counselor suggested I start keeping a journal, a place where I could be completely honest about my feelings, without worrying about hurting anyone else. So here I am, 42 years old, writing in a diary like a teenager, trying to figure out how my life got so complicated. Marriage counselor, the words seemed to float off the page and hover in front of my eyes. Daniel was seeing a marriage counselor. Without me, he was discussing our relationship with a professional stranger, working through problems I didn't even know we had, and he had never mentioned it. Not once, in all the conversations we had shared over the past 3 months, had he suggested that our marriage might need professional intervention. I sank down onto the closed toilet seat, the journal open in my lap, trying to process this information. When people went to marriage counseling, it was usually because their relationship was in serious trouble. It was what couples did when they were on the verge of separation, when communication had broken down completely, when they needed a neutral third party to help them navigate issues too complex or emotionally charged to handle on their own. But we weren't those people. We were happy. We were stable. We had our minor disagreements, like any couple, but nothing that couldn't be resolved with a simple conversation and maybe a bottle of wine. We laughed together, we supported each other's careers, we had built a comfortable life in our small suburban home, with our 2 cats and our carefully tended garden. We weren't the type of couple who needed therapy, or at least, I hadn't thought we were. I forced myself to continue reading, even though each word felt like a small betrayal of the life I thought I knew. I've been going to Dr. Martinez for 6 weeks now, and she keeps asking me about communication patterns in my marriage. She wants to know how Sarah and I handle conflict, whether we're able to be vulnerable with each other, if there are topics we avoid discussing. The honest answer is that we don't really have conflict, which apparently is part of the problem. According to Dr. Martinez, couples who never fight often aren't being completely honest with each other. They're avoiding difficult conversations, keeping their real feelings to themselves to maintain peace. The entry continued for several more paragraphs, detailing conversations with this Dr. Martinez that painted a picture of our marriage I barely recognized. According to Daniel's account, we were polite strangers, living parallel lives, going through the motions of intimacy, without ever really connecting on a deep emotional level. He wrote about feeling lonely, even when we were in the same room, about wondering if I truly knew him, or just the version of himself he presented to keep our relationship comfortable and conflict-free. Reading his words felt like looking at our life through a funhouse mirror, everything familiar but distorted beyond recognition. Was this really how Daniel saw our marriage? Had I been so focused on maintaining our comfortable routine that I had failed to notice he was struggling? The man who wrote these entries sounded lost, confused, desperate for something he couldn't quite articulate. He sounded nothing like the Daniel who kissed me goodbye every morning and asked about my day every evening. I turned the page, drawn deeper into this alternate version of our shared reality. The next entry was dated a week later, and the tone was different, more urgent. Had another session with Dr. Martinez today, and she asked me to think about what I really want from my marriage. Not what I think I should want, or what would be easiest, but what would actually make me happy. I've been so focused on being a good husband, on not causing problems, that I'm not sure I know how to answer that question anymore. When was the last time Sarah and I had a conversation that lasted more than 10 minutes? When did we stop being curious about each other's inner lives? We're like roommates who happen to share a bed and a mortgage. The words stung because there was truth in them that I couldn't deny. When was the last time we had talked about something meaningful? Really talked, not just coordinated schedules, or shared funny stories from our respective workdays. When had we stopped asking each other the kinds of questions that revealed who we were becoming, not just who we had been when we met 15 years ago? I tried to remember the last deep conversation we had shared, and came up empty. Our interactions had become predictable, comfortable, safe. We discussed practical matters, what to have for dinner, whether the gutters needed cleaning, plans for upcoming weekends. We shared affection in small routine ways, a kiss goodbye in the morning, a hand on the shoulder while passing in the kitchen, the comfortable warmth of his body next to mine in bed at night. But when had we stopped talking about our dreams, our fears, our hopes for the future? When had we become so focused on maintaining our smooth, conflict-free relationship that we had forgotten to actually connect with each other? The next entry made my chest tighten with a different kind of anxiety. Dr. Martinez thinks I should tell Sarah about the therapy sessions. She says that keeping secrets, even well-intentioned ones, creates distance in a relationship. But how do I explain that I've been seeing a marriage counselor for weeks without making her feel like I've been lying to her? How do I tell the woman I love that I've been so unhappy in our marriage, that I sought professional help, without making her feel like she's failed as a wife? She's going to want to know why I didn't come to her first, why I didn't try to work through these feelings with her before involving a stranger. The irony of reading about Daniel's concern for my feelings while secretly reading his private journal wasn't lost on me. Here he was, agonizing over how to be honest with me, while I was violating his privacy in the most fundamental way possible. But I couldn't stop reading. I had to know what else he had been hiding, what other aspects of our life together looked different from his perspective. As I continued through the entries, a picture emerged of a man who felt trapped by his own contentment. Daniel wrote about feeling guilty for being unhappy when he had everything he was supposed to want: a stable marriage, a comfortable home, financial security. He described our relationship as a well-oiled machine that ran smoothly but had somehow lost its purpose, its passion, its ability to surprise or challenge either of us. Some entries focused on specific incidents that had taken on larger significance in his mind. The time I had declined his suggestion to take a spontaneous weekend trip to the mountains, choosing instead to stay home and catch up on household tasks. The evening he had tried to initiate a conversation about whether we wanted to travel more, and I had gotten distracted by emails from work. The morning he had mentioned feeling restless, and I had responded by asking if he wanted me to pick up groceries on my way home from work. Reading these accounts, I could see how my responses, which had seemed perfectly reasonable at the time, might have felt dismissive to someone who was struggling with deeper questions about our life together. I had been so focused on maintaining our routine, on being efficient and practical, that I had missed the fact that my husband was trying to tell me he needed something more. But the entry that truly shattered my understanding of our marriage was dated just 2 weeks ago. Something happened in therapy today that I can't stop thinking about. Dr. Martinez was asking me about the early days of our relationship, trying to understand what had drawn Sarah and me together initially. I was describing how we met, how we fell in love, all the usual stories we tell at dinner parties. But then she asked me a question that stopped me cold. When was the last time you felt truly seen by Sarah? When did you last feel like she was genuinely curious about who you are now, not just who you were when you first got together? I sat there for probably 5 minutes, trying to think of an answer, and couldn't come up with one. Not because Sarah doesn't care about me, but because we've become so comfortable with our roles, so settled in our routines, that we've stopped growing together. We're like two plants that started out intertwined but have gradually grown in different directions without noticing. We share the same soil, the same sunlight, but we're not really touching anymore. Dr. Martinez suggested that maybe the problem isn't that we don't love each other, but that we've confused love with comfort. She said that real intimacy requires ongoing curiosity, ongoing effort to know and be known. It requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires risk. We've created a relationship that feels safe but isn't really alive. I had to stop reading for a moment and just breathe. The journal slipped from my hands and fell to the bathroom floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the small space. Daniel's words were describing a marriage I recognized but had never thought to question. We were comfortable, we were stable, we were boring. We had traded passion for peace, growth for security, and somehow along the way, we had lost the ability to truly see each other. But there was more. I picked up the journal again, driven by a need to understand the full scope of what I had been missing. The entries that followed detailed Daniel's growing awareness of his own emotional numbness, his realization that he had been going through the motions of marriage without fully engaging with the experience. He wrote about feeling like an actor playing the role of a husband, hitting all the right marks, but never quite feeling authentic. The most recent entry was dated just 3 days ago, and it contained information that made my heart race. Dr. Martinez wants me to bring Sarah to a session. She thinks we've reached the point where individual therapy isn't enough, where the real work needs to happen with both of us in the room. She wants to create a space where we can have the kinds of conversations we've been avoiding, where we can be honest about what's working and what isn't in our marriage. I've been putting off asking Sarah to come with me because I'm terrified of her reaction. What if she doesn't want to do the work? What if she's happy with the way things are and sees my dissatisfaction as a personal failing? What if therapy reveals that we're too different, too set in our ways, to ever really connect on a deeper level? What if trying to fix our marriage actually breaks it? But I can't keep living in this limbo. I can't keep pretending that polite contentment is the same thing as happiness. Sarah deserves to know what I've been going through, even if it's uncomfortable. She deserves the chance to decide whether she wants to fight for something more meaningful between us. I'm going to ask her tonight. Tonight Daniel was planning to ask me to attend marriage counseling with him tonight. He was going to reveal that he had been secretly unhappy in our marriage for months, that he had been seeing a therapist to work through problems I didn't know existed. He was going to shatter the comfortable illusion of our perfect relationship and ask me to join him in the messy, difficult work of rebuilding something more authentic. And I was sitting on our bathroom floor, reading his private journal, discovering all of this in the worst possible way. The sound of Daniel's footsteps in the hallway sent panic shooting through my chest. I scrambled to close the journal and shove it back into the medicine cabinet, my hands shaking so badly, I nearly dropped it again. I managed to get the other bottles and tubes, arranged roughly the way they had been before, though I knew Daniel would notice if he looked closely. The medicine cabinet door still stuck when I tried to close it, and I had to give it a firm push that made more noise than I would have liked. "Sarah, everything okay in there?" Daniel's voice came from just outside the bathroom door, casual but with an undertone of concern. "Fine." I called back, probably too quickly and too loudly. "Just grabbed some ibuprofen. Head's a little achy this morning." I heard him pause, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he might come in and see my flushed face, my guilty expression, the evidence of my violation, written all over my features. But then his footsteps continued toward the kitchen, and I heard the familiar sounds of him starting the coffee maker and opening the refrigerator. I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror, trying to compose my face into something resembling normalcy.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The woman looking back at me looked guilty, shocked, and completely unprepared for the conversation that was apparently coming that evening. How was I supposed to act normal for an entire day, knowing what I knew? How was I supposed to respond to Daniel's revelation with anything approaching authenticity when I had already read his private thoughts about our marriage? But more importantly, how was I supposed to process the fact that my husband had been profoundly unhappy for months, and I had been completely oblivious to his suffering? I splashed cold water on my face and tried to think rationally about what I had discovered. Daniel wasn't having an affair. He wasn't planning to leave me. He was trying to save our marriage, to find a way to reconnect with me, to build something more meaningful between us. The secrecy wasn't about betrayal. It was about his own fear of hurting me, his uncertainty about how to bridge the gap that had grown between us. But the fact remained that there was a gap, a significant one, apparently, and I had been too comfortable, too complacent, too focused on maintaining our peaceful routine to notice that my husband was drowning in quiet desperation. The guilt was overwhelming. How had I missed so many signs? How had I become so disconnected from the person I shared my life with that he felt he needed professional help to figure out how to talk to me? What kind of wife was I that my husband felt safer confessing his feelings to a stranger than to me? But underneath the guilt was something else, a strange sort of relief. Our marriage wasn't perfect. It wasn't the model of compatibility I had always believed it to be. But that meant it also wasn't too late to change it, to grow, to become something more than we had been. Daniel's willingness to seek help, to do the difficult work of examining our relationship, suggested that he still believed we were worth fighting for. The question was whether I was brave enough to join him in that fight. I thought about the journal entries I had read, about Daniel's descriptions of feeling unseen and unknown. Had I really become that oblivious to his inner life? When was the last time I had asked him about something other than his work schedule or weekend plans? When had I last been curious about his dreams, his fears, his hopes for our future together? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Daniel's assessment of our marriage was uncomfortably accurate. We had become roommates who shared a bed and a mortgage. We had confused routine with intimacy, comfort with connection. We had built a life that ran smoothly but somehow lacked the vitality, the growth, the ongoing discovery that should characterize a thriving marriage. But we still had time to change that. We still had the opportunity to choose each other again, more consciously this time, with full awareness of what real intimacy would require from both of us. The coffee maker beeped in the kitchen, followed by the sound of Daniel pouring his first cup of the day. In a few minutes he would appear in the bathroom doorway, hair still damp from his shower, looking for his tie or checking his reflection one last time before heading to work. He would kiss me goodbye, tell me to have a good day, and leave for another day at the office where he would probably think about our marriage and wonder how to approach the conversation he was planning for that evening. And I would go to work too, carrying the weight of knowledge I wasn't supposed to have, trying to figure out how to respond to his revelation in a way that honored both his courage in seeking help and his trust in finally including me in the process. But there was something else I needed to do first. Something that felt essential, even though I wasn't sure I had the courage to follow through with it. I needed to see Dr. Martinez for myself. I needed to understand what Daniel had been experiencing in those therapy sessions, what insights he had gained about our marriage that he felt he couldn't share with me directly. I needed to know what it looked like from the outside, this relationship I had been living inside of for 15 years without really seeing clearly. The idea of following Daniel to therapy felt like a violation, another betrayal to add to the growing list of ways I had crossed boundaries that morning. But it also felt like the only way to truly understand what we were dealing with, what kind of work we would need to do to rebuild our connection. And if I was being completely honest with myself, I needed to know what Daniel said about me when he thought I would never hear it. I needed to understand how he really saw me, our marriage, our life together. The journal entries had given me glimpses, but they were filtered through Daniel's own confusion and guilt. In therapy, with a skilled professional guiding the conversation, he might be more direct, more honest about what he really wanted from our relationship. The decision crystallized as I heard Daniel moving around in the bedroom, getting ready for another day of pretending everything was normal, while privately working through the dissolution of his faith in our marriage. I was going to find out where Dr. Martinez's office was located, and I was going to be there when Daniel arrived for his next appointment. I had no idea what I would hear, what revelations awaited me in that therapist's office, but I knew I couldn't sit through dinner that evening, listening to Daniel carefully explain his months of secret unhappiness, without understanding the full context of what he had been experiencing. I needed to know the truth about my marriage, even if that truth was going to hurt. I needed to hear my name spoken in that therapy session, to understand how I appeared in Daniel's narrative of our relationship. I needed to know who I really was in the story of our love, not who I had always assumed myself to be. Finding Dr. Martinez's office required more detective work than I had anticipated. Daniel's journal entries mentioned her name frequently, but never included specifics like an address or phone number. I spent my lunch break at work scrolling through psychology practice websites, cross-referencing therapists named Martinez with marriage counseling specialties in our metropolitan area. The receptionist at my dentist's office had always been chatty about local healthcare providers, so I called with a fabricated story about needing a referral for a friend who was dealing with marital difficulties. After mentioning that my friend specifically wanted a female therapist named Dr. Martinez, she helpfully provided the name and address of Dr. Elena Martinez, a licensed marriage and family therapist whose practice was located in a converted Victorian house about 20 minutes from our neighborhood. My hands were shaking as I wrote down the information. This felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross, violating Daniel's privacy in a way that went far beyond reading his journal. But the need to understand what he had been experiencing, what our marriage looked like from the outside, was stronger than my guilt about the deception. The building that housed Dr. Martinez's practice was painted a soothing sage green with white trim, surrounded by carefully maintained gardens that probably looked spectacular in spring, but now showed the dormant browns and grays of late autumn. A small brass plaque beside the front door listed several mental health professionals, with Dr. Elena Martinez's name appearing third from the top. The sight of her name in elegant script made everything feel suddenly real and irreversible. I had called that morning and learned from the receptionist that Dr. Martinez had appointments available on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Since today was Thursday, and Daniel had mentioned having a session this week, there was a reasonable chance he would be here today. I parked across the street in the lot of a small coffee shop, positioning myself where I could see the entrance to the therapy building, while remaining relatively inconspicuous. The waiting felt interminable. I ordered a latte I didn't want, and sat at a window table, pretending to work on my laptop while actually watching every car that pulled into the therapy building's small parking lot. At 2:30, a silver Honda Civic arrived that looked familiar, and my heart started racing before I could even confirm it was Daniel's car. When he emerged from the driver's seat, wearing the navy blue sweater I had given him for his birthday last year, the reality of what I was doing hit me with full force. I was spying on my husband. I was about to eavesdrop on his private therapy session. I was violating his trust in ways that would probably damage our marriage more than whatever problems he had been discussing with Dr. Martinez. But I couldn't leave. I had come too far, learned too much, to turn back now. I needed to hear what Daniel said about me when he thought I would never know. The therapy building had large windows on the ground floor, and I could see into what appeared to be a waiting room with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. Daniel disappeared inside, and I waited another 10 minutes before crossing the street and approaching the building myself. My plan, such as it was, involved pretending to be interested in scheduling my own therapy appointment. I would tell the receptionist I was dealing with work-related stress and wanted to explore counseling options. This would give me a reason to be in the building, and hopefully an opportunity to determine which office was Dr. Martinez, and whether there was any way to overhear what was happening inside. The receptionist was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a loose bun. She looked up from her computer screen as I entered, offering a warm smile that made me feel even more guilty about my deception. "Hi there, how can I help you today?" "I'm hoping to schedule a consultation," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I've been dealing with some stress lately, and I think talking to someone might help." "Of course, I'd be happy to help you with that. Are you looking for individual therapy, or did you have a specific type of counseling in mind?" "Individual therapy. I think I've heard good things about Dr. Martinez, specifically. Is she accepting new patients?" The receptionist consulted her computer screen. "Dr. Martinez does have some availability, though her schedule is quite full. She specializes in couples counseling primarily, but she does see individual clients as well. Would you like me to check her next available appointment?" "That would be wonderful, and I was wondering, would it be possible to get a sense of her approach? I'm a little nervous about starting therapy, and it would help to know what to expect." "Absolutely. Dr. Martinez's office is just down the hall if you'd like to take a quick look at the space. She's currently with a client, but I can show you the general setup. Many people find it helpful to see where they'll be meeting before their first appointment." My pulse quickened. Dr. Martinez was currently with a client, which almost certainly meant she was meeting with Daniel right now. The receptionist stood up and gestured for me to follow her down a short hallway lined with nature photographs and motivational quotes in subtle frames. "Here's Dr. Martinez's office," she said, indicating a door with a nameplate and what appeared to be soundproofing around the frame. "She's designed the space to feel very comfortable and non-threatening. Many clients tell us they forget they're in a therapy office within a few minutes of arriving." I nodded and made appropriate sounds of interest, but my attention was focused on the door and whether there was any possibility of hearing what was happening inside. The soundproofing looked professional and thorough, and I realized that my plan to somehow eavesdrop had been naive from the start. "The sessions are completely confidential, of course," the receptionist continued. "Martinez is very particular about privacy and making sure clients feel safe to share whatever they need to discuss." We walked back toward the reception area, and I scheduled a fake appointment for the following week, knowing I would need to call and cancel it once this whole situation resolved itself. As I was leaving, I noticed a small alcove near Dr. Martinez's office that contained a water cooler and some chairs, probably intended as an additional waiting area for clients who preferred more privacy. An idea began forming, desperate and probably futile, but the only option I could think of for learning what I needed to know. I left the building and returned to the coffee shop, waiting until I saw other clients arrive and depart from the therapy practice. The pattern seemed to be that most appointments lasted about 50 minutes, with small gaps between sessions to allow for client transitions. If Daniel's appointment had started around 3 o'clock, it would probably end sometime before 4. At 3:45, I returned to the therapy building, telling the receptionist I had forgotten something in my car, and would just be a moment. She was busy with paperwork, and barely looked up as I headed back down the hallway. Instead of leaving through the front door, I slipped into the small alcove near Dr. Martinez's office and settled into one of the chairs, hoping I looked like a client waiting for an appointment rather than a woman engaging in an elaborate deception. The soundproofing was effective, but not perfect. Sitting in the chair closest to the office door, I could hear the low murmur of voices, though individual words were impossible to make out. The rhythm of conversation was clear, though Dr. Martinez's voice, steady and encouraging, followed by longer stretches of what had to be Daniel speaking. I strained to hear anything recognizable, any word or phrase that might give me insight into what they were discussing. The frustration of being so close to the answers I needed, yet unable to access them, was almost unbearable. I was sitting less than 6 feet away from my husband, as he discussed our marriage with a professional, and I might as well have been on another planet. Then, clear as if she had been speaking directly to me, I heard Dr. Martinez say my name. "How do you think Sarah would respond if she knew you were here?" The question hung in the air, and I held my breath, waiting for Daniel's response. When it came, his voice was loud enough that I could make out most of his words, though some were still muffled by the door and walls between us. "I honestly don't know," he said, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, even through the soundproofing. "Part of me thinks she'd be hurt that I didn't come to her first. She might feel like I was giving up on us, or like I didn't trust her enough to work through our problems together. And another part of you thinks what? Another part of me thinks she might not even realize there are problems to work through. Sarah seems genuinely happy with our marriage the way it is. She never complains, never asks for anything different. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the only one who feels like something's missing." The words hit me like a physical blow. Daniel thought I was obliviously content with our marriage, unaware that he was struggling, satisfied with a relationship that left him feeling empty and disconnected. He saw me as someone who was either too shallow to crave deeper intimacy, or too complacent to notice that our connection had become superficial. "Tell me more about that," Dr. Martinez said. "What makes you think Sarah is satisfied with the current dynamic in your marriage? She never initiates conversations about our relationship. She seems content with our routine, our social life, the way we spend our time together. When I try to bring up bigger questions about what we want from life, she tends to redirect the conversation to more practical matters. I've started to feel like she sees me as a reliable partner for managing household logistics, rather than someone she's genuinely curious about as a person." I wanted to protest, to defend myself against these characterizations, but as I listened to Daniel's perspective, I had to acknowledge that there was truth in his observations. When was the last time I had asked him about his dreams, his fears, his hopes for our future? When had I last initiated a conversation about anything deeper than our weekend plans, or the grocery list? "Can you give me a specific example of this pattern?" Dr. Martinez asked. "Last month, I was feeling really restless about work, questioning whether I was in the right career, wondering if I should consider making a change. I tried to talk to Sarah about it over dinner one evening, explained that I was having some doubts about the direction of my professional life. Her immediate response was to suggest I update my resume and start networking, as if the issue was just a matter of finding a better job, rather than figuring out what I actually wanted to do with my life." I remembered that conversation, and I remembered my response. At the time, I had thought I was being helpful, practical, supportive. It hadn't occurred to me that Daniel might be looking for something other than solutions, that he might need me to listen to his uncertainty, rather than immediately trying to fix it. "How did that feel for you?" Dr. Martinez asked. Like she wasn't really hearing me, like she was treating a symptom instead of trying to understand the underlying issue. I wasn't looking for career advice. I was trying to share something I was struggling with, something that was affecting how I felt about my life in general. But Sarah seemed to want to solve the problem quickly, so we could move on to other topics. "And how do you think Sarah perceived that conversation?" "Probably that she was being a good wife, offering practical support and encouragement. She's very good at that kind of thing, very efficient at problem solving. But efficiency isn't the same thing as intimacy, and I think sometimes she confuses the two." The accuracy of his assessment was devastating. I had been proud of my ability to support Daniel, to offer practical solutions to whatever challenges he was facing. I had seen my efficiency as a strength, my ability to help him solve problems as evidence of my value as a partner. It had never occurred to me that what he needed wasn't solutions, but simply the experience of being truly heard and understood. What would you have wanted from Sarah in that moment? Dr. Martinez asked. I would have wanted her to ask me more questions. To be curious about what was driving my restlessness, what I was really searching for. I would have wanted her to share her own thoughts about career satisfaction, or tell me about times when she had questioned her own choices. I would have wanted to feel like we were exploring the topic together, like she was genuinely interested in my inner life, rather than just trying to help me get unstuck. And do you think Sarah would be capable of that kind of engagement, if she understood what you needed? There was a long pause before Daniel answered, and when he did, his voice was softer, more uncertain. I think so. I hope so. Sarah is an intelligent, caring person. We've gotten into patterns that don't really serve either of us. We've created a marriage that runs smoothly, but doesn't challenge us to grow or stay curious about each other. I think if she understood what I was looking for, she might be willing to try something different. But you have doubts. I have doubts about whether she wants something different. She seems genuinely content with our relationship the way it is. And I worry that if I ask for more emotional intimacy, more vulnerability, more of the kind of conversations that require real risk and openness, she might feel like I'm being demanding or ungrateful for what we already have. The conversation continued, but I was having trouble processing Daniel's words through the emotional storm they had created in my chest. He saw me as someone who was content with superficiality, someone who valued efficiency over intimacy, someone who might resist his attempts to deepen our connection, because it would require more effort than I was willing to invest.
But what was most painful was realizing that his assessment wasn't entirely wrong. I had been content with our smooth-running marriage. I had been proud of our ability to avoid conflict, to manage our household efficiently, to present a picture of domestic harmony to the world. I had confused the absence of problems with the presence of genuine connection. Sarah, there's something else I need to discuss with you, Dr. Martinez was saying, and it took me a moment to realize she was still talking to Daniel, not addressing me directly. You mentioned last week that you've been having some physical symptoms that you think might be related to stress. Can you tell me more about that? I've been having trouble sleeping, waking up in the middle of the night with my mind racing. My appetite has been off, and I've been getting headaches more frequently. I know these things can be related to emotional stress, but I wasn't sure if they were significant enough to mention. I thought about the past few months, trying to remember if I had noticed Daniel having trouble sleeping or eating differently. The truth was, I hadn't been paying attention. We slept in the same bed every night, but I had been so focused on my own rest that I hadn't noticed if he was lying awake beside me. We ate meals together regularly, but I had been thinking about my own hunger, my own preferences, without really observing his patterns. These physical symptoms are often our body's way of telling us that something needs attention, Dr. Martinez explained. Chronic stress, especially the kind that comes from feeling emotionally disconnected or misunderstood in important relationships, can manifest in exactly the ways you're describing. So you think my marriage is making me sick? Daniel asked, and there was a bitter edge to his voice that I had never heard before. I think your marriage, as it currently exists, isn't meeting some of your fundamental emotional needs, and that's creating stress that's affecting your overall well-being. But that doesn't mean your marriage is broken beyond repair. It means it needs attention, care, and probably some significant changes in how you and Sarah relate to each other. Which brings us back to the question of whether Sarah would be willing to do that work. Which brings us back to the question of whether you're willing to find out. You can't know how Sarah will respond to your needs unless you express them clearly and give her the opportunity to respond. Right now, you're making assumptions about her based on patterns that may not reflect her true capacity for growth and change. But what if I'm right? What if she really is content with the way things are, and asking for more just makes her feel pressured or criticized? Then you'll have important information about your marriage that will help you make informed decisions about your future. But you might also discover that Sarah has been feeling as disconnected as you are, and has been waiting for permission to address it. The possibility that I might be as unhappy as Daniel, just better at hiding it from myself, was something I hadn't considered. Had I been settling for comfort because it felt safer than risking the vulnerability that real intimacy required? Had I been avoiding deeper conversations not because I was content, but because I was afraid of what we might discover if we looked too closely at our relationship? I've been thinking about asking Sarah to come to a session with me, Daniel said, but I'm terrified of her reaction. What if she sees it as an ultimatum?
or evidence that I think our marriage is failing? How would you want to frame the invitation? I don't know. I want to be honest about why I've been coming here, about what I've learned about myself and our relationship. But I also want to make it clear that I'm not giving up on us, that I think we could have something really beautiful if we're willing to work for it. That sounds like a conversation worth having, regardless of how Sarah initially responds. The fact that you're willing to be vulnerable about your needs and your hopes for your marriage is actually a gift you can offer her, even if it feels scary. And if she says no, if she doesn't want to come to therapy or doesn't think our marriage needs work, then you'll know that too. And you can decide whether you want to continue working on your own growth and perspective, whether you want to try different approaches to connecting with Sarah, or whether you need to consider other options for your future happiness. The session was winding down, and I could hear chairs moving, papers rustling, the sounds of Daniel preparing to leave. I needed to get out of the alcove before he emerged from Dr. Martinez's office and discovered me sitting there like some kind of amateur detective. But as I stood up to leave, Daniel's voice came through the door one more time, and what he said stopped me in my tracks. "Dr. Martinez, can I ask you something? Do you think it's possible for two people to love each other, but still be completely wrong for each other? Because sometimes I feel like Sarah and I are speaking different languages, wanting different things from life, even though we're both good people who care about each other." That's a profound question, Daniel. What do you think? I think maybe love isn't enough by itself. Maybe compatibility matters more than I wanted to believe. Maybe some people are just better suited for each other, and no amount of therapy or communication can bridge certain fundamental differences. And do you see those fundamental differences between you and Sarah? I value emotional intimacy, deep conversations, ongoing growth and challenge in a relationship. Sarah seems to value stability, comfort, predictability. I want a marriage that pushes both of us to become more than we were individually. Sarah seems happy with a marriage that allows us to maintain our individual selves without much interference or challenge. Those differences don't have to be incompatible, Daniel. They could be complementary if both partners understand and appreciate what the other brings to the relationship. But they do require conscious negotiation and mutual respect. Which brings us back to the question of whether Sarah wants to do that kind of negotiating. Which brings us back to you taking the risk of finding out. I heard Daniel's appointment ending, heard him scheduling his next session, heard Dr. Martinez wishing him well until they met again. I managed to slip out of the alcove and make it to the front door before Daniel emerged from the office, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the building could hear it. As I walked quickly back to my car, Daniel's words echoed in my mind. He questioned whether we were fundamentally compatible, whether our different approaches to marriage and life could ever be reconciled. He saw me as someone who valued stability over growth, comfort over challenge, and he wasn't sure those differences could be bridged. But what struck me most was the sadness in his voice when he talked about potentially being wrong for each other despite loving each other. This wasn't a man who was looking for reasons to leave his marriage. This was a man who was trying desperately to find reasons to stay, to believe that the problems between us could be solved rather than simply managed. The drive home passed in a blur of competing emotions. Guilt about violating Daniel's privacy, warred with gratitude for finally understanding what he had been experiencing. Heard about his assessment of my character, competed with recognition that his observations were uncomfortably accurate. Fear about the future of our marriage battled with hope that maybe, now that I knew what he needed, I could find a way to give it to him. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I had made several decisions. First, I was going to confess to Daniel that I had found his journal and read it. The deception was eating away at me, and I couldn't participate authentically in the conversation he was planning for that evening, while hiding the fact that I already knew everything he was going to tell me. Second, I was going to say yes to couples therapy before he even finished asking. I was going to tell him that I wanted to do the work, that I was willing to challenge myself to become a better partner, that I understood our marriage needed more than comfortable routine to thrive. And third, I was going to start asking him the kinds of questions I should have been asking all along. Questions about his dreams, his fears, his hopes for our future. Questions that demonstrated genuine curiosity about who he was becoming, not just who he had been when we first met. But first, I needed to sit with what I had learned about myself.
Daniel's characterization of me as someone who valued efficiency over intimacy, stability over growth, wasn't flattering, but it wasn't entirely inaccurate either. I had been so focused on maintaining our comfortable life that I had stopped being curious about whether that life was actually fulfilling for either of us. The question now was whether I could change, whether I could learn to prioritize emotional connection over practical problem solving, vulnerability over comfort, growth over stability. Whether I could become the kind of partner Daniel needed without losing the parts of myself that had value. As I sat in my car in our driveway, looking at the house we had shared for 8 years, I realized that everything was about to change. The comfortable illusions of our perfect marriage were about to be shattered, and we were going to have to decide whether we wanted to build something more authentic in their place. The evening ahead felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, not knowing whether stepping forward would mean falling or flying. But one thing was certain: the marriage we had known was ending today, and what came next would depend entirely on our willingness to be brave enough to start over. The kitchen felt different when I walked through the front door that evening. Same granite countertops, same stainless steel appliances, same framed photos of our vacation to Maine 3 summers ago, but everything carried the weight of impending change. I could hear Daniel upstairs in his office, probably finishing up work emails before dinner, and I knew that within the next few hours, our comfortable life would be irrevocably altered. I had spent the remainder of the afternoon driving aimlessly through our neighborhood, processing what I had overheard in Dr. Martinez's office, and trying to figure out how to handle the conversation that was coming. The guilt about reading Daniel's journal and spying on his therapy session felt like a physical weight in my chest, but underneath that guilt was something unexpected: relief. For the first time in months, maybe years, I understood what was wrong between us. The vague sense of distance I had occasionally noticed but dismissed, the feeling that we were going through the motions of marriage without really connecting, the way our conversations had become predictable and surface level, all of it finally made sense. We hadn't grown apart because we were incompatible. We had grown apart because we had stopped making the effort to truly know each other. But Daniel's words about fundamental differences, about possibly being wrong for each other despite loving each other, haunted me. Was I really the kind of person who prioritized stability over growth, comfort over challenge? Had I become so focused on maintaining our peaceful routine that I had forgotten how to be curious about my own husband's inner life? The sound of Daniel's footsteps on the stairs sent my heart racing. I busied myself with preparing dinner, grateful for the familiar task of chopping vegetables and stirring pots, anything to keep my hands occupied while my mind reeled with everything I needed to confess. "Hey," he said, appearing in the kitchen doorway with his usual end-of-day smile, though I could see the tension around his eyes that I now realized had been there for weeks. "Smells good in here. How was your day?" The ordinary question felt loaded with significance. How was my day? "I discovered that you've been secretly unhappy in our marriage for months. I violated your privacy by reading your personal journal. I followed you to therapy and eavesdropped on your session. I learned that you see me as someone who values efficiency over intimacy, and that you question whether we're fundamentally compatible." "Actually," I said, setting down the wooden spoon I had been using to stir the sauce, "I need to talk to you about something important." Daniel's expression shifted immediately, the casual tiredness replaced by alert concern. "Okay, should we sit down?" "No, I think I need to stay busy while I say this, or I might lose my nerve." I turned back to the stove, unable to meet his eyes while I began what felt like the most important conversation of our marriage. "This morning when I was looking for ibuprofen, I accidentally knocked everything out of the medicine cabinet, and I found your journal." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel Daniel's stillness behind me, the way the entire kitchen seemed to hold its breath while he processed what I had just admitted. "You found my journal," he repeated slowly, his voice carefully neutral in a way that told me he was working hard to control his reaction. "Yes, and I read it. Not all of it, but enough to understand that you've been seeing a marriage counselor, that you've been unhappy with our relationship, that you've been struggling with feelings you felt you couldn't share with me." "Sarah," his voice was quiet, and when I finally turned around to face him, his expression was a complicated mix of hurt, relief, and something that might have been fear. "How much did you read?" "Enough to know that you've been carrying this alone for months. Enough to know that you think I'm satisfied with a marriage that leaves you feeling disconnected and unseen.
Enough to know that you're planning to ask me to come to therapy with you tonight. Daniel sank into one of our kitchen chairs, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized as his way of dealing with overwhelming stress. I had this whole conversation planned, this careful way of explaining everything, without making you feel like I was criticizing you or our marriage. There's more, I said, forcing myself to continue before I lost the courage. I went to Dr. Martinez's office today. I followed you there, and I listened to part of your session. The look of shock on Daniel's face was like a physical blow. You what? I know how terrible that sounds. I know it was a violation of your privacy, of the therapeutic relationship, of your trust. But I needed to understand what you've been experiencing, what our marriage looks like from the outside. I needed to hear what you say about me when you think I'll never know. Daniel stood up abruptly, pacing to the kitchen window and back, his movements sharp with agitation. Sarah, do you understand what you've done? Therapy is supposed to be a safe space, a place where I can work through my feelings without worrying about how they might hurt you. You've taken that away from me. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But Daniel, I also learned things about myself that I needed to know. I learned that you see me as someone who values efficiency over intimacy, who avoids difficult conversations, who might not be willing to do the work that real marriage requires. And the hardest part is that you're not entirely wrong. He stopped pacing and looked at me directly for the first time since I had started talking. What do you mean? I mean that when you tried to talk to me about feeling restless at work, my immediate response was to offer practical solutions instead of trying to understand what you were really going through. I mean that I've been so focused on maintaining our comfortable routine that I stopped being curious about who you're becoming as a person. I mean that I've confused the absence of conflict with the presence of genuine connection. Daniel's expression softened slightly, some of the defensive anger giving way to cautious interest. You heard that conversation today. I heard you tell Dr. Martinez that you question whether we're fundamentally compatible, whether love is enough to bridge the differences in what we want from marriage. I heard you say that you value emotional intimacy and ongoing growth, and that you think I value stability and predictability. I heard you wondering if I would even want to do the work of building something deeper between us. And what do you think about what you heard? I took a deep breath, knowing that my answer to this question would determine the direction of our conversation, and possibly our marriage. I think you're right about a lot of things. I have been prioritizing comfort over challenge, routine over growth. I have been avoiding the kind of vulnerable conversations that real intimacy requires. But I don't think that means we're incompatible. I think it means I've been afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of what we might discover if we look too closely at our relationship. Afraid that if I stopped being the efficient problem-solving wife, you might not like who I actually am underneath all that competence. Afraid that real intimacy might require more of me than I was prepared to give. Daniel returned to his chair, his anger seeming to dissipate as he listened to my words. Sarah, when did you start feeling like you had to perform a role instead of just being yourself in our marriage? The question caught me off guard, and I had to think about it for a moment before I could answer. I think it happened gradually. Early in our relationship, you were attracted to my independence, my ability to handle things on my own, my practical approach to problems. And I think I started believing that those qualities were what you loved about me, so I emphasized them more and more. I became hyper-competent, hyper-efficient, because I thought that's what made me valuable as a partner. But those weren't the only things I loved about you. They weren't even the most important things. What were the most important things? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was gentler than it had been since I started my confession. Your curiosity about the world. The way you would ask unexpected questions that made me see familiar things differently. Your willingness to be silly, to laugh at yourself, to try new things even when you weren't sure you'd be good at them. The way you would get excited about small discoveries, a new restaurant, a book that made you think, a conversation with a stranger that gave you a different perspective on something. As he spoke, I realized that the woman he was describing was someone I hadn't been in years. When was the last time I had asked him an unexpected question, or shared excitement about a small discovery, or been willing to be silly and vulnerable? When had I become so focused on being competent that I had forgotten how to be curious? What happened to that person? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer.
I think she got scared. I think she decided that being reliable was safer than being spontaneous, that being efficient was more valuable than being authentic. And I think I contributed to that by not telling you what I really needed from our relationship, by not asking for more of the curiosity and playfulness and willingness to grow that I fell in love with in the first place. So where does that leave us now? Daniel looked at me across our kitchen table, and for the first time in months, I felt like he was really seeing me, not just the role I had been playing. I think it leaves us with a choice. We can decide that the problems between us are too fundamental to overcome, that we're too different in what we want from marriage. Or we can decide that we want to rediscover who we are individually and together, that we're willing to take the risks that real intimacy requires. And what do you want to choose?
I want to choose us. The real us, not the comfortable, polite version we've been settling for, but I need to know that you want that too, that you're willing to be uncomfortable sometimes, to have difficult conversations, to challenge each other to grow. I need to know that you want something more than just a marriage that runs smoothly. The relief that flooded through me was so intense I had to sit down. I do want that. I want to be curious about you again, to ask you the kinds of questions that reveal who you're becoming. I want to share my own thoughts and fears and dreams, instead of just managing our household logistics. I want to risk being authentic with you, even when it's messy or uncertain. Even if it means sometimes being wrong, sometimes having conflict, sometimes needing to apologize and try again. Especially then. Daniel, I've been so afraid of disrupting our peaceful life, that I forgot peace isn't the same thing as happiness. I forgot that real love requires ongoing effort, ongoing choice, ongoing willingness to be vulnerable with each other. Daniel reached across the table and took my hand, and the simple contact felt electric in a way it hadn't for months. So what do we do now? How do we start building something different? I think we start by being honest about what we need from each other, and I think we go to Dr. Martinez together, and learn how to have the kinds of conversations we've been avoiding. You want to go to couples therapy. I want to learn how to be married to you in a way that honors who we both really are, not just who we think we're supposed to be. If therapy can help us do that, then yes, I want to go. Daniel squeezed my hand, and when he smiled, it was the first genuine smile I had seen from him in weeks. Dr. Martinez is going to be very interested to meet you, especially given the circumstances of how you already know about her. About that, I said, feeling the guilt return. I need to figure out how to make amends for violating your privacy, for invading your therapeutic space. That was wrong, regardless of what I learned from it. It was wrong, Daniel agreed, but I also understand why you did it. And maybe the fact that you were willing to take such a drastic step to understand what I was going through tells me something important about how much you care about our marriage. It tells you that I'm capable of terrible judgment when I'm scared of losing you. It tells me that you're willing to fight for us, even if your methods need some work. We sat in our kitchen as the sun set outside our windows, holding hands across the table where we had shared thousands of meals, and talked about what we wanted our marriage to become. Daniel told me about the loneliness he had been feeling, the sense that we were living parallel lives rather than building a shared one. I told him about my fear of being vulnerable, my belief that competence was safer than authenticity, my worry that the real me might not be enough to keep him interested. The real you is what I fell in love with, he said. The real you is what I've been missing. The real you is what I've been too scared to ask for. I replied, I've been so focused on being what I thought you needed, that I forgot to pay attention to who you actually are. As we talked, I began to understand that the work ahead of us wasn't about fixing what was broken in our marriage. It was about building something entirely new on the foundation of who we had become as individuals over the past 15 years. We weren't the same people who had fallen in love in our 20s, and our marriage needed to reflect the growth and change we had both experienced. Can I ask you something? I said as we finally got up to finish preparing dinner. In your session today, when you talked about fundamental differences between us, do you really think we might be incompatible? Daniel considered this as he helped me set the table, and I appreciated that he didn't give me an immediate reassuring answer. I think we have different natural tendencies and preferences. I think we've developed different coping mechanisms and communication styles. But I don't think those differences have to be deal breakers if we're both willing to understand and appreciate what the other person brings to the relationship. What do you think I bring to the relationship? Not the efficient problem-solving version of me, but the real me. You bring groundedness. You bring the ability to find beauty in ordinary moments. You bring a kind of steady presence that makes me feel safe to be vulnerable.
You bring intelligence and humor, and a way of seeing practical solutions that I often miss when I'm caught up in emotional complexity. And what do you bring? I think I bring curiosity about people and ideas. I bring a willingness to explore difficult emotions rather than trying to solve them quickly. I bring the kind of questions that push both of us to think more deeply about what we want from life. Those sound like complementary strengths, not incompatible differences. They could be if we learn how to appreciate them in each other, instead of being frustrated by them. The dinner we shared that night was different from any meal we had eaten together in months. Instead of discussing practical matters or sharing superficial updates about our respective days, we talked about our fears for our marriage, our hopes for what we could build together, our willingness to risk discomfort in service of deeper connection. "I'm scared," I admitted, as we cleared the dishes. "I'm scared that I've forgotten how to be the person you fell in love with. I'm scared that I'll try to change and fail, or that I'll change and you won't like who I become." "I'm scared too," Daniel said. "I'm scared that asking for more from our marriage will somehow damage what we already have. I'm scared that you'll do the work because you feel like you have to, not because you genuinely want something different. How will we know if we're making real progress, or just going through the motions? I think we'll know because we'll feel more connected, not just more informed about each other. We'll feel curious about each other's thoughts and feelings, not just obligated to ask the right questions. We'll feel excited about growing together, not just committed to working on our problems." That night, as we got ready for bed, everything felt both familiar and completely new. We were sleeping in the same bedroom, brushing our teeth in the same bathroom, following the same nighttime routine we had maintained for years. But we were also two people who had chosen each other again, consciously and deliberately, with full awareness of what real intimacy would require from both of us. "Daniel," I said as we turned off the lights, "thank you for not giving up on us before I figured out what was happening. Thank you for being brave enough to fight for us once you did figure it out, even though I violated your privacy and spied on your therapy session. Even though you made some questionable choices in service of understanding what was wrong between us. We'll figure out how to rebuild trust around that, just like we'll figure out how to rebuild intimacy in general." 3 weeks later, we sat in Dr. Martinez's office for our first couples session. The space was exactly as the receptionist had described: comfortable, non-threatening, designed to feel more like a living room than a clinical setting. Martinez herself was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a direct manner that immediately put me at ease, despite the awkward circumstances of our introduction. "So," she said, settling into her chair with a slight smile, "I understand we have an unusual situation here. Daniel, you've been seeing me individually for several months, and Sarah, you've been inadvertently involved in our work through some rather unconventional means." I felt my face flush with embarrassment, but Dr. Martinez's tone was matter-of-fact rather than judgmental. "I want to acknowledge that what happened was a violation of therapeutic boundaries, and we'll need to address that as part of our work together. But I also want to say that the fact that you're both here, willing to be honest about what happened and committed to doing the work of rebuilding your marriage, tells me something important about your relationship." "What does it tell you?" Daniel asked. "It tells me that you both value your marriage enough to take significant risks for it. Daniel, you risked vulnerability by seeking help, and eventually involving Sarah in the process. Sarah, you risked Daniel's anger by reading his journal and following him here. Those weren't the safest or most conventional choices, but they were the choices of people who care deeply about their relationship." Over the following months, Dr. Martinez helped us understand the patterns we had fallen into and develop new ways of connecting with each other. We learned that Daniel's need for emotional intimacy and my need for stability didn't have to be opposing forces. They could be complementary aspects of a healthy relationship if we learned to communicate about them effectively. We practiced having difficult conversations, sharing fears and desires we had been keeping to ourselves, asking each other questions that went beyond surface-level check-ins. We learned to sit with discomfort instead of immediately trying to solve or avoid it, to see conflict as an opportunity for deeper understanding, rather than a threat to our peaceful home. The work wasn't easy. There were sessions where we left feeling frustrated and disconnected, evenings when our attempts at vulnerability felt forced and awkward, moments when we both wondered if we were trying to change something that was fundamentally incompatible. But there were also breakthroughs that reminded us why we had chosen each other in the first place. The evening Daniel asked me about my childhood dreams, and listened without trying to offer solutions or advice. The morning I shared my fears about my career trajectory, and he responded with curiosity rather than immediate encouragement. The night we stayed up until 3 in the morning, talking about what we wanted the next decade of our lives to look like. 6 months after that first couples session, we took a weekend trip to the mountains, the same trip I had declined when Daniel first suggested it. But this time, when he mentioned wanting to go somewhere with no distractions, no agenda, just time and space to be together, I said yes immediately. We spent 2 days hiking trails we had never explored, cooking simple meals together in our cabin, talking about everything and nothing. On our last evening, as we sat by the fire we had built together, Daniel looked at me with an expression I recognized from our early dating days. "What?" I asked, smiling at his obvious contentment. "I was just thinking about how different this feels from the trip I originally suggested. If we had gone then, we would have been polite with each other, efficient in our planning, careful not to create any friction. We would have come home feeling like we had accomplished something, but not necessarily feeling more connected. And how does this feel? Like we're actually married to each other, not just living parallel lives in the same house. Like we're curious about each other, interested in growing together, willing to be imperfect and real, instead of just comfortable." I reached for his hand across the space between our chairs. Dr. Martinez was right about something she said in one of our early sessions. She said that real intimacy isn't about never having problems. It's about being willing to work through problems together, to let them teach you something about each other, rather than just trying to solve them as quickly as possible. What has working through our problems taught you about me? It's taught me that you're braver than I realized, willing to risk everything comfortable and predictable for the chance of something more meaningful. It's taught me that your need for emotional depth isn't demanding or unrealistic. It's what makes you capable of the kind of love I actually want to experience. And what has it taught you about yourself? That I'm stronger than I thought, that I can handle discomfort and uncertainty without losing myself, that the part of me that wants to grow and explore and ask difficult questions is still there. It was just buried under years of trying to be the perfect low-maintenance wife. As we drove home the next day, I realized that the woman sitting in the passenger seat was both the same person who had found Daniel's journal 8 months earlier, and someone completely different. I had learned to value authenticity over efficiency, growth over comfort, connection over peace. I had rediscovered the curiosity and willingness to be vulnerable that Daniel had fallen in love with, but in a deeper, more intentional way. Our marriage wasn't perfect. We still had moments of misunderstanding, still struggled sometimes to bridge the gap between our different communication styles and emotional needs. But we had something we hadn't had before: the tools and willingness to work through those challenges together, to see them as opportunities for deeper intimacy rather than threats to our stability. The journal that had started everything now sat openly on Daniel's nightstand, no longer hidden but also no longer necessary. He had found other ways to process his feelings, ways that included me rather than excluding me, and I had learned to create space for his emotions without immediately trying to fix or solve them. "Do you ever regret how we got here?" I asked as we pulled into our driveway. "Do you wish I had found a different way to discover what was happening between us?" Daniel considered this as he turned off the car. "I regret that you felt like you had to spy on me to understand what I needed. I regret that I was so afraid of your reaction that I kept my struggles secret for so long. But I don't regret that we ended up here, having the kind of marriage we should have been building all along, even though it required so much discomfort and uncertainty, especially because it required discomfort and uncertainty. The marriage we had before was comfortable, but it wasn't really alive. This version of us, this willingness to keep choosing each other consciously and deliberately, this feels like something worth the effort." That evening, as we unpacked from our trip and settled back into our daily routine, I caught myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I was genuinely curious about Daniel's inner experience, not because I felt obligated to ask the right questions, but because I genuinely wanted to know what he was thinking and feeling. "What was your favorite part of this weekend?" I asked as we made dinner together. "The conversation we had yesterday morning, when you told me about your fear of being ordinary, of living a life that doesn't matter. I've never heard you talk about existential concerns before, and it made me realize how much of your inner life you've been keeping private." I didn't even realize I was keeping it private. I think I believed that those kinds of thoughts were too abstract, too unproductive to share. but sharing them made me feel closer to you than I've felt in years. It made me understand that you're not actually satisfied with surface-level contentment any more than I am. You just express your deeper longings differently. What's your favorite part? He asked. The moment this morning when you started laughing at that ridiculous story I told about my coworker, and I realized I haven't heard you laugh like that in months. It reminded me how much I love making you happy, not in an efficient problem-solving way, but in a genuine playful way. You've always been good at that when you let yourself. I'm learning to let myself again. As we ate dinner, we talked about our plans for the coming week, but also about our hopes for the coming year, our dreams for the kind of life we wanted to build together. The conversation flowed between practical and profound, covering everything from grocery lists to questions about meaning and purpose that we were finally brave enough to explore together. Later that night, as we lay in bed talking about nothing in particular, Daniel turned to me with an expression of wonder that made my heart skip. What? I asked, smiling at his obvious amazement. I was just thinking about how different this feels from a year ago. If someone had told me then that finding my journal would lead to the strongest, most authentic version of our marriage we've ever had, I would never have believed them. Are you glad I found it? I'm glad we found our way to each other again. However messy and unconventional the path was, I'm glad we ended up here. Here was a marriage built on genuine curiosity about each other, willingness to be vulnerable and imperfect, commitment to ongoing growth rather than comfortable stagnation. It was a relationship that honored both our need for stability and our need for challenge, that celebrated our differences rather than trying to minimize them. It was the marriage we should have been building all along, and it was worth every moment of discomfort and uncertainty it had taken to find our way to it. 2 years had passed since that pivotal weekend in the mountains, and I was standing in the bathroom where everything had started, staring at the same medicine cabinet that had once concealed Daniel's journal. The difference was that now, instead of hiding secrets, it contained the ordinary detritus of a life lived openly. Prescription bottles with both our names clearly visible, my birth control pills sitting next to Daniel's allergy medication, a small bottle of lavender oil we both used for sleep. The transformation hadn't been immediate or dramatic in the way that movies might suggest. Instead, it had been a gradual evolution, like watching a garden grow through careful tending rather than witnessing a sudden bloom. There had been setbacks, moments when we slipped back into old patterns of polite distance or efficient problem-solving without emotional connection. But each time we recognized what was happening, we had the tools to course correct, to remember what we were building together. This morning felt different though. There was an anticipation in the air that I couldn't quite identify, a sense that something significant was about to shift in our carefully reconstructed world. Daniel had been unusually quiet during breakfast, not in the withdrawn way that used to signal his inner turmoil, but with the thoughtful concentration of someone processing something important. I have something I want to discuss with you tonight, he had said, as he gathered his things for work. Nothing urgent, nothing worrying, just something that's been on my mind lately. The old version of me would have immediately pressed for details, would have needed to know exactly what he was thinking about to feel secure. But I had learned to trust Daniel's timing, to believe that when he said it wasn't urgent or worrying, he meant it. I had also learned that some thoughts needed time to develop before they could be shared productively. My workday passed in the usual rhythm of meetings and emails, but underneath the professional routine, I found myself genuinely curious about what Daniel wanted to discuss. Not anxious, not worried about potential problems, but excited by the prospect of learning something new about his inner world. This shift in my default emotional response to uncertainty had been one of the most profound changes in how I moved through not just our marriage, but life in general. When I arrived home that evening, I found Daniel in the kitchen, not cooking but sitting at our table with a cup of tea, and what appeared to be several handwritten pages spread in front of him. He looked up when I entered, and his expression was a mixture of nervousness and excitement that immediately caught my attention. "That looks serious," I said, setting down my work bag and moving to kiss him hello. "Should I be concerned about those pages?" "Actually, they're letters," Daniel said, and for a moment my heart skipped, before I remembered that we were different people now, that secrets and hidden communications were no longer part of our dynamic. "Letters I've been writing to Dr. Martinez, but that I've decided I want to share with you instead." I poured myself a glass of water and sat down across from him, noting that his hands weren't shaking the way they had been that night, 2 years ago, when we first began being honest with each other. Whatever he wanted to share, he was approaching it with confidence rather than fear. "Tell me about these letters," I said, settling into the familiar rhythm of curiosity that had become natural between us. "Remember when Dr. Martinez suggested that we continue individual work alongside our couple sessions? She recommended that I keep writing as a way to process my thoughts and feelings, but instead of keeping a private journal, she suggested I write letters to someone specific. I chose her initially, thinking it would help me prepare for our sessions. That sounds like a healthy approach. What changed?" Daniel picked up one of the pages, and I could see his careful handwriting filling both sides. "What changed is that I realized I wasn't really writing to Dr. Martinez anymore. I was writing to you, writing to the version of you that I was learning to know and trust with my most honest thoughts. Writing to my partner in this marriage we're rebuilding." The warmth that spread through my chest was immediate and profound.
The idea that Daniel had been mentally addressing his most private thoughts to me, that I had become his imaginary confidant rather than someone he needed protection from, felt like the ultimate evidence of how far we had traveled together. "Would you like to read them?" he asked. "They're not secrets this time. They're thoughts I want to share but haven't found the right moment for, feelings I've been processing that I think might interest you. I would love to read them." Daniel handed me the first page, dated 3 months earlier. "This one I wrote after that dinner party at Mike and Jennifer's house, when you and I ended up in that long conversation with their neighbor about sustainable living. I remembered the evening well. We had stayed much later than planned, drawn into a fascinating discussion about intentional communities and alternative ways of structuring daily life. The conversation had touched on everything from environmental responsibility to questions about what constituted a meaningful existence. Dear Sarah," the letter began, and seeing my name in Daniel's handwriting as a greeting rather than a distant reference made my heart flutter in a way that surprised me. "I've been thinking about something you said tonight at the dinner party, when Tom asked whether we thought most people were living the lives they actually wanted or just the lives they thought they were supposed to want. Your response was so thoughtful, so genuinely curious about human motivation, and it reminded me of something I'd forgotten about you." I looked up at Daniel, who was watching my face as I read. "What had you forgotten?" "Keep reading," he said with a smile. "I'd forgotten that you don't just think about practical matters, that your mind goes to deep places when given the opportunity. Tonight I watched you engage with ideas about purpose and authenticity with the same intensity you bring to solving problems at work, and I realized that I've been underestimating your intellectual curiosity. Not because you don't have it, but because we've created so many opportunities for you to express the practical side of your intelligence and so few opportunities for you to explore the philosophical side." The letter continued for several more paragraphs, detailing observations about my interests and capabilities that I hadn't even fully recognized in myself. Daniel had noticed my engagement with abstract concepts, my questions about meaning and purpose, my genuine fascination with how other people made decisions about their lives. He had seen aspects of my personality that I had almost forgotten existed. "This is beautiful," I said, feeling slightly emotional as I finished reading. "But also a little overwhelming. You see me so clearly, sometimes more clearly than I see myself." "That's what the next letter is about, actually," Daniel said, handing me another page. "This one I wrote after you mentioned feeling like you weren't sure who you were outside of your role as my wife and your identity as a professional." This letter was dated just 6 weeks earlier, after a conversation we'd had during one of our evening walks about individual identity within marriage. I had confessed to feeling sometimes uncertain about which of my thoughts and preferences were authentically mine, and which had developed in response to our shared life. "Dear Sarah," this letter began, "I want you to know that your uncertainty about your individual identity doesn't worry me the way you think it should. What I see when I look at you is someone who's in the process of discovering that she's more complex and multifaceted than she previously understood. You're not losing yourself in our marriage, you're finding aspects of yourself that didn't have space to emerge in your previous version of independence." Reading Daniel's perspective on my internal struggles was revelatory. Where I saw confusion, he saw growth. Where I worried about losing my sense of self, he observed me expanding my understanding of who I could be. His letters revealed a level of attention to my emotional and intellectual development that felt like being truly seen in a way I had never experienced. "There are 5 more letters," Daniel said as I finished the second one.
Each one represents something I've been thinking about, something I wanted to share with you but hadn't found the right context for. They're not urgent communications, just ongoing thoughts about our life together. I spent the next hour reading through Daniel's letters, each one offering insights into his experience of our marriage that were both intimate and analytical. He wrote about noticing changes in how I approached friendships, becoming more willing to have difficult conversations rather than avoiding potential conflict. He observed my increasing comfort with uncertainty, my growing ability to sit with unanswered questions without immediately seeking resolution. One letter focused entirely on a moment when I had disagreed with him about a political issue, something that would have been unthinkable in our previous dynamic, where I prioritized harmony over authentic expression. Daniel wrote about how attractive he found my willingness to hold different opinions, how energizing it was to be married to someone who challenged his thinking rather than simply supporting it. Another letter detailed his observations about my relationship with my own ambition, how I had begun to pursue professional opportunities that genuinely interested me rather than just those that seemed safe or practical. He wrote about watching me take risks, make choices based on curiosity rather than security, become someone who was actively shaping her life rather than just managing it effectively. These letters are like receiving the most thoughtful gift, I said as I finished the last one. But I'm also curious about something. Why didn't you share these thoughts with me as you were having them? What made you want to write them down first? Daniel considered this question seriously, the way he approached all inquiries about his internal processes. I think I needed time to understand what I was observing before I could articulate it clearly. Some thoughts need to develop in private before they're ready to be shared. Writing these letters helped me recognize patterns in my thinking, helped me see what I was noticing about you and our marriage more clearly. And now you're ready to share them. Now I'm ready to share them, and I'm also ready to ask you something that I've been thinking about for months. There was something in Daniel's tone that suggested we were approaching the real reason for this evening's conversation. I set the letters aside and gave him my full attention, the way I had learned to do when something important was being offered. What would you like to ask me? Daniel reached across the table and took my hands in his, a gesture that had become natural between us but still carried weight when used deliberately. I want to ask you if you'd be interested in making a significant change in how we structure our life together. Not because anything is wrong, but because I think we've outgrown some of the assumptions we've been operating under. What kind of change? I've been offered an opportunity to take a sabbatical from work, to spend 6 months writing and traveling and exploring questions about what I want the next phase of my career to look like. It would mean significant changes to our routine, our income, our plans. But it would also mean an opportunity to discover what we're like together when we're not managing the logistics of our familiar life. The proposal was unexpected, and I felt my initial response shifting through several emotions before settling into genuine excitement. The old version of me would have immediately focused on the practical challenges, the financial implications, the disruption to our carefully established routine. But the person I had become was primarily curious about the adventure being offered. Tell me more about what this would look like, I said, and I could hear the interest in my own voice. Daniel's face lit up with relief and enthusiasm. The sabbatical would start in 3 months. I'd be free to work on a book project I've been thinking about, and we could travel to places we've talked about but never prioritized. You could potentially work remotely for part of the time, or take a leave of absence, or we could figure out some other arrangement that appealed to you. What's the book project? It's about marriage, actually. About the difference between relationships that simply endure and relationships that continue to evolve. I want to explore how couples can maintain individual growth while building something meaningful together. The irony of Daniel wanting to write about marriage after our own transformation was not lost on me, but it also felt perfectly appropriate. We had learned something valuable about how relationships could change and grow, and sharing that knowledge felt like a natural extension of our own work. This sounds amazing, I said, realizing as I spoke that I meant it completely. It sounds like exactly the kind of adventure I didn't know I wanted. Really, you're not worried about the practical complications, the financial uncertainty, the disruption to everything we've built here. Of course I'm aware of those factors, I replied, laughing at how well Daniel knew my thought processes.
But I'm more excited about the possibility of discovering what we're like together when we're not operating from habit and routine. I'm curious about what questions we'll ask each other when we're in new places, having new experiences. So you want to do this? I want to do this. Daniel stood up and moved around the table to embrace me, and in his arms I felt the same sense of potential and possibility that had characterized our relationship since we began rebuilding it consciously. This wasn't the comfortable safety of our previous marriage, but it wasn't the terrifying uncertainty of crisis either. It was the excitement of two people who trusted each other enough to take risks together, who were curious about their own capacity for growth and change. There's one more thing, Daniel said as we separated. I want to document this experience, not just the travel and the writing, but how we navigate such a significant change together. I want to pay attention to what we learn about ourselves and each other when we're outside our familiar environment. Like a joint project. Like a joint project. You could write about your experience while I write about mine, and we could explore how the same events look different from our individual perspectives. The idea appealed to me immediately. I had discovered through our therapy work and our deeper conversations that I enjoyed examining my own emotional and intellectual responses to experiences. The opportunity to do that while sharing an adventure with Daniel felt like the perfect combination of individual exploration and shared growth. That night, as we made plans for our sabbatical, I found myself thinking about the woman who had discovered Daniel's journal in this same bathroom 2 years earlier. She had been so focused on maintaining stability and avoiding disruption that she almost missed the opportunity to build something extraordinary with the person she loved most. The woman I had become was still practical, still thoughtful about consequences and planning, but she was also willing to embrace uncertainty when it offered the possibility of meaningful experience. She had learned that the most important security came not from avoiding change, but from trusting her ability to navigate change successfully. Are you nervous about any aspect of this plan? I asked Daniel as we lay in bed that night, our conversation continuing in the comfortable darkness. I'm nervous about whether I'll be able to write something worthwhile, whether the book project will justify the time and financial investment. But I'm not nervous about us, about our ability to handle whatever challenges come up during the sabbatical. What makes you feel confident about us? The fact that we've already proven we can rebuild our relationship from the ground up when necessary. The fact that we've learned to communicate about difficulties rather than just trying to avoid them. The fact that we're genuinely curious about each other and committed to continuing to grow together. I thought about his words as I drifted toward sleep and realized that our marriage had become something I had never thought possible, a relationship that was both deeply stable and continuously evolving, both secure and adventurous, both comfortable and challenging. The sabbatical would be our next experiment in conscious partnership, our next opportunity to discover what was possible when two people chose each other daily rather than just once. And for the first time in my adult life, I was more excited about uncertainty than afraid of it, because I knew I wouldn't be facing it alone. 6 months later, I was sitting in a small cafe in Prague, watching Daniel across the cobblestone square as he interviewed an elderly couple about their 50-year marriage. The morning sun caught the silver in his hair, and I smiled at how animated he became when discussing something that genuinely fascinated him. This version of my husband, fully engaged with his passion project, was someone I was still getting to know. Our sabbatical had taken us through 8 countries, each stop revealing new layers of ourselves and our relationship. In Barcelona, we had learned that I was braver than either of us realized when I enrolled in a week-long intensive Spanish course, despite having no previous language experience. In Amsterdam, Daniel discovered he had a talent for photography that had been buried under years of practical concerns. But it was here in Prague, our final stop before returning home, that the most significant revelation occurred. I had been writing daily throughout our journey, documenting not just our travels, but my internal experience of this dramatic life change. What started as personal journaling had evolved into something more structured, more intentional. 3 weeks ago, Daniel had read some of my entries and made a suggestion that initially terrified me. You should submit these to publishers, he had said over breakfast in Vienna. This isn't just personal reflection anymore, you're writing about something other people need to read. The idea that my private thoughts about marriage, growth, and self-discovery might have value beyond our relationship had never occurred to me. Writing had become a tool for processing experience, not a potential career path. But Daniel's encouragement, combined with positive feedback from several people who had read excerpts, made me consider possibilities I had never imagined. Now, as I watched him conduct his final interview for his own book, I was drafting a query letter to literary agents. The irony wasn't lost on me that we had both found our authentic professional voices during a sabbatical from our careers, discovering passions that had been dormant during years of practical focus. How did it go? I asked when Daniel rejoined me at the cafe table. Incredible. Joseph and Marie have been married 53 years, and they still surprise each other regularly. Joseph told me that the secret isn't avoiding change, but changing together deliberately. Marie said the key is staying curious about who your partner is becoming, rather than holding them to who they used to be. That sounds familiar, I said, thinking about our own transformation. It does, and it confirms something I've been thinking about throughout this whole project. The couples who thrive long-term aren't the ones who never face challenges. They're the ones who use challenges as opportunities to choose each other again, more consciously each time. I looked at Daniel across the small table, this man who had risked everything comfortable and predictable to save our marriage, and felt a surge of gratitude for his courage. Without his willingness to seek help, to be vulnerable about his needs, to push for something deeper than our polite contentment, we might have remained trapped in a marriage that looked successful from the outside, but felt hollow from within. Speaking of choosing each other consciously, I said, pulling out the letter I had been working on, I have something to show you. Daniel read my query letter with the focused attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. When he finished, he looked up with an expression of pride and excitement that made my chest tighten with emotion. "Sarah, this is brilliant. You're ready for this." "I'm terrified," I admitted. What if publishers don't think there's a market for this kind of story? What if my writing isn't good enough? What if I'm being delusionally optimistic about my abilities? Then you'll learn something valuable from the experience and decide what to try next. But what if you're exactly right about your abilities? What if there are thousands of people who need to read about what's possible when couples are willing to do the difficult work of really knowing each other? The confidence in his voice reminded me of something Dr. Martinez had said during one of our final sessions. The goal isn't to eliminate uncertainty from your life. The goal is to develop enough trust in yourselves and each other that you can navigate uncertainty together. That evening, our last night in Prague, we found ourselves talking about returning home, with the same sense of adventure we had brought to leaving. The sabbatical had changed us individually and as a couple, but more importantly, it had proven that we could handle significant change without losing the connection we had worked so hard to rebuild. "What are you most looking forward to about going home?" Daniel asked, as we walked along the Vltava River. "Honestly, I'm excited to apply what we've learned about ourselves to our regular life. I want to see if we can maintain this level of curiosity and intentionality when we're back to familiar routines." "And what are you most nervous about?" "Slipping back into old patterns without realizing it. Getting so focused on practical concerns that we stop prioritizing our emotional connection." Daniel stopped walking and turned to face me under one of the bridge's old-fashioned streetlights. "Can I tell you something I've realized during these 6 months? Always, you're not the same person who might slip back into old patterns without realizing it. The woman I've traveled with these past months is someone who pays attention to her internal experience, who asks for what she needs, who takes risks for the sake of growth. That person doesn't disappear just because we go home." "How can you be so sure?" "Because change that happens consciously, through practice and intention, becomes part of who you are. It's not something you have to maintain through constant effort, it's something that's integrated into your way of being in the world." 3 months after returning home, I was sitting in the same kitchen where Daniel had first shared his hidden letters, opening an email that would change everything. A literary agent wanted to represent my book. A major publisher was interested in my story about marriage, growth, and the courage required to choose love consciously. Daniel was at his laptop across the room, putting finishing touches on his own manuscript, which had already garnered interest from 3 different publishers. We had both found ways to transform our personal experience into something that might help other people navigate their own relationships more skillfully.
Sarah, Daniel said, looking up from his screen. Remember that conversation we had in Prague, about staying curious about who each other is becoming? Of course, I just want you to know that I'm more interested in who you are now than I was when we first met 15 years ago. You've become someone I didn't even know was possible, and I'm excited to see who you become next. The words hit me with the force of recognition. This was what we had been building toward all along, not a marriage that remained static and safe, but one that could evolve continuously, while maintaining its core commitment. We had learned to love each other not despite change, but because of our capacity for growth. That night, as we celebrated our book deals, and talked about the speaking engagements and workshops we might offer together, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. From hidden journal, to eavesdropped therapy session, to conscious partnership, to published authors sharing our story with the world. The marriage we had now bore little resemblance to the one that had almost ended 3 years earlier. We had become people who could handle conflict productively, who asked for what we needed, who remained curious about each other's inner lives. We had learned that love wasn't a feeling that happened to us, but a choice we made daily, a commitment to seeing and supporting each other's authentic selves. Do you think, I asked Daniel as we turned off the lights that night, that we would have found our way to this kind of relationship eventually, even without the crisis? I don't know, he said honestly. But I think sometimes it takes almost losing something to understand how much it really matters to you. Sometimes you have to break something apart completely before you can rebuild it consciously. And you're glad we went through all of that. The pain, the uncertainty, the difficult work. I'm glad we went through it together. I'm glad we were both brave enough to choose something harder but more meaningful than what we had before. As I drifted toward sleep that night, I realized that our story had become something neither of us could have written alone. It was the story of two people who had learned to be truthful with each other, to take risks for the sake of authentic connection, to build something extraordinary from the ruins of something ordinary. We had discovered that the best marriages aren't the ones that never face challenges, but the ones that use challenges to become more conscious, more intentional, more genuinely intimate. We had learned that love is both simpler and more complex than we had ever imagined, simpler because it requires only honesty and willingness, more complex because those qualities demand continuous courage and growth. The woman who had found that hidden journal 3 years ago could never have imagined where we would end up. But then again, that was the point. Real love creates possibilities you can't envision from where you're standing now. It invites you to become someone you didn't know you could be, with someone who's willing to make that journey alongside you. And that, I thought as sleep took hold, was worth every moment of uncertainty it had taken to find our way here. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.